How many times does the revolution have to fail before it succeeds? And is our world the crappy sort of world where utopian plans always fall into the wrong hands? Do the good guys die and do the bad guys, by kind of virtue of not being dead, take their place and then go on to run the world? Could I make it any more obvious how relevant these questions are to China? Here to rein me in and keep the conversation smart and subtle and not quite so meat-fisted? No, not meat-fisted. Ham-fisted. Here to keep the conversation not ham-fisted is translator Canaan Morse. I'm going to be interviewing him about his translation of Peach Blossom Paradise, which is the first book in Ge Fei's Jiangnan Trilogy. Ge Fei we've covered on the show before. It was his He Se Niao Chun, Flock of Brown Birds. Eric Abrahamson was the guest, and Canaan, I think, is Eric's pal, so that's worked out nicely. But before all of that, we're going to go do the TrChFic news, the translated Chinese fiction news. All the news items today are basically just lifted off of Paper Republic's Twitter. Although one of the three items I already knew about, but it also happened to be on their Twitter. So that one it's debatable where I got that one from. But in any case, I just kind of plucked these from a handy place because I didn't have any news sourced by myself, I suppose, which would lead me to say, if you ever have some news relating to Chinese lit, translated Chinese lit, that you'd like me to kind of amplify on the show here in this section, then yeah, just let me know. I'd love to, and you are literally saving me some work or a chore or whatever. So as long as it's on topic, I'm really happy to cover it. So please just get in touch via social media. I'll just plug social media now, actually, since it seems like the right time. So Instagram's a good place to contact me at TrChFic, TrChFic. That's the podcast Instagram. My own personal Twitter is the one I use for the show too. It's at Angus Likes Words. Those are the best ways, really. The show does have a Facebook. Oh, Discord is actually really good too. You'll find a Discord invite link in the show notes and on the podcast website. Right, let's actually get on and do the news now. So our first item, this is a little blog post. It's called There and Back Again, Tracking Down Transliterations in Stories of the Sahara. So it's Mike Fu, who was on the show, talking about Stories of the Sahara, which is his translation of the wonderful Sanmao and her dispatches from northwest Africa. So he's talking about, I think we covered this on the podcast actually, but so there were words that Sanmao had transliterated in Chinese. So something from the local, I think Arabic was one of the local languages, but the Bedouin people there, she would take their words, write them out in Chinese characters, and Mike had to do a considerable amount of research tracing these words back to their source and then translating them into English. So pretty fun little blog for you guys to check out. That'll be linked in the show notes. The next item of news is also just on the Paper Republic website, like Mike's article. It's the 2020 roll call of published translations from Chinese, and it's broken down into fiction, poetry. Is there non-fiction? Let me click this link and see. Oh yes, as well as, I'll go through the sections actually. So it lists the various prizes which were won by translated Chinese fiction and their authors. There's a breakdown of gender balance, so whether it's men or women winning the prizes and getting published. There's links to some star reviews. Then there's a list of general fiction and classic fiction. So you could say stuff by living writers, stuff by dead writers, if we're being very broad. There's a special section for science fiction and fantasy. Yep, that's cool to see. Then we have a non-fiction section. Then we have poetry. Then we have children's books. Oh, great. Okay, yeah, so a lot of good stuff there. Excellent. Yes. Now, our next news item, it is something I tweeted, but it's worth a slot in the news too. It's a book that another former show guest, Deathblade, Jeremy Bai, the wuxia web fiction, mostly, translator has brought out. It's his little guide to understanding Chinese fantasy genres. So these are wuxia, xianxia, and xuan. Don't know if I said that very well. Xuan isn't a opinion sound I run into very often now that I think about it. But yeah, so if you're wondering what those are, you can listen to my episode with him or some of the other wuxia season episodes I did, or you can buy his book. I believe it's, on one hand, if you want to get a flavour of what it's like, you can go watch his YouTube videos explaining these different genres. but he's said that there is like content there, a refined, edited, coherent, boiled down version of them, but he's added other extrapolations and thoughts too. So, I mean, he really knows his stuff. So if you're looking for an intro, I'm guessing a fairly concise intro to these genres, although I don't know. I don't know how long it is. This would be a good place to go looking. And he's a nice chap. So yeah, your support would be going to a good cause is maybe the wrong word, but a good guy. A good guy who really cares about what he's doing. So yeah, speaking of good guys who care about what they're doing, let's get on to the interview, because I think Canaan Morse fits that description, and I think the author for this episode, Ge Fei, does too. So yeah, without further ado, interview time. Right, so we have on the show Canaan Morse. Oh, I always do this. Is that a correct pronunciation of your name?
That is the correct pronunciation, okay. Yes.
I was pretty sure, but I wanted to check.
You just beat out every Starbucks barista ever.
Do they say like Canaan or something?
Yo, I get all kinds. I get Canaan, Canaan. I have a lot of people who say, "Oh, Canaan, like Cain and Abel," and I'm like, "No, that's 3 words."
Cain and Abel. There might be a Mr. Abel out there somewhere called Canaan. That would be funny. Anyway, starting again. We've got on the show Canaan Morse. Nice to have you on, Canaan. I don't know if it's too early to say Merry Christmas, but in any case, Merry Christmas. How's it going, and what have you been up to lately?
Well, Merry Christmas to you too, Angus. I have been doing as much as I can to sort of keep up with the general pace of life during the COVID pandemic over here in the northeastern US. I was originally supposed to be in China right now as a Fulbright scholar in Beijing doing dissertation research, but first the COVID pandemic and then the government cancellation of the Fulbright China program, which was incredibly regrettable, have forced me here to stay here. And I am teaching a survey course in classical Chinese literature at Boston University. I'm actually in the middle of grading final exams today and preparing to spend a semester in Taiwan instead.
Oh, well, there you go. Are you off to Taipei, or is it a different part of Taiwan?
No, I will be in Taipei, affiliated with the Academia Sinica, the Zhongyan Yuan. And I've changed my proposal up significantly because my research, in terms of field work at least, deals specifically with a form of popular cultural performance that's localized in Beijing. I research Pingshu, long form storytelling, Shan Tianfang style Pingshu, and its connection to ancient literature. But in Taiwan, I'll be looking at a bunch of old texts that they have down there in their libraries, and trying to write a dissertation chapter and definitely continuing to translate and write.
Cool. I haven't, or if I have heard of the Fulbright Scholar Program before, it's in a bunch of other things filed away in my head. But I do know over the last few years, a few different things like that, things that like exchange programs between the States and China, and maybe China and other countries have been kind of like the drawbridges pulled up, and it's not all been down to the pandemic, right? It's been down to geopolitics.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And our idiot president, Donald Trump, had no beneficial effect on that whatsoever.
No.
His attempt to do whatever it is he's trying to do has broken a lot of really productive cultural ties that American scholars and researchers of all kinds and teachers have had with the outside world, including and most particularly China.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a number of, I was the beneficiary of the golden age of Chinese education back as a college student. I went to 2 different immersion programs in Beijing, once as a junior, once as a sophomore, and once as a postgrad, and they were amazing. And neither of those programs exist anymore.
It's a shame. It makes you wonder what the future holds, but I guess who knows, because the number of curveballs history keeps throwing at us seems to be unlimited. You've told us a wee bit about yourself and your journey as a translator, or at least your education in Chinese language and other things Chinese. Is there anything else you can tell us, I guess, given that we're the translated Chinese fiction show, about your journey translating like stories, Chinese fiction that people can buy off Amazon or whatever?
Well, most of the things that I have translated are not still available for sale. I began in college. After I came back from China, I wanted to do a senior thesis in East Asian studies, and I searched around for good stories by contemporary Chinese authors, and I ended up with a novella by a very well-known contemporary author named Wang Shuo.
Yeah.
Who you have heard of, a number
Yes.
of people have heard of. Yeah, so he had a very, probably his first well-known novella was actually called 空中小姐, the stewardess. And I picked that one out almost random and translated it. It was an academic project. I translated and prefaced it, and after I had the whole thing done, I set out on an endless, a vain journey to get in touch with Wang Shuo, that after many, many years and plenty of bogus cell phone numbers ended up all coming to naught. But that was the first project. And the second, I moved into modern Chinese literature, the literature of the May 4th period, and did a bunch of short stories by a modernist author named He Qifang. And that was the beginning of my publication history as a translator. I managed to place one of those stories when I was very young. I got one into the Kenyan Review, and then a couple of the other pieces in the years following that. And it was right about that time that I was 23. I moved back to China, began working with Eric Abramson on Paper Republic, and we started to really get into the business end of Paper Republic and then into the magazine. And by that time, everything was in full swing from a translation standpoint.
It sounds like you were a lot more put together at 23 than I was. That's impressive.
You know, all of our stories in the telling sound like we were more put together than we really were.
Yeah. I often wonder that when I've managed to do something decent amidst the general kind of muddling through of my life, and people only see the decent part. I wonder if it's the same for everyone else. I guess that's
exactly
true. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, we all have, I don't know about you, but my mid-20s, early and mid-20s, there were a lot of, it feels like there were oceans of lost hours and plenty of long dark nights of the soul. But I was in Beijing at the time, doing a number of different things. And it's funny, they seem, looking back privately, we often think that we wasted a lot of time. But you may find when you look back again with a calendar in hand that actually, you know, you were always doing something.
Yeah, not all those who wander are lost, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned Wang Shuo there, and you mentioned Eric Abrahamson. So if anyone's listening and is interested in either of those names, Eric Abrahamson was on this very show before, talking about actually the very same author that we're talking about today, Ge Fei. Yes, we did Flock of Brown Birds with him. And Wang Shuo, he's somewhat dear to the heart of this podcast because he was the very second author we covered in episode 2. We did his, I say we, it's just me. I did his Please Don't Call Me Human, and I've got the other novel of his available in translation, Playing for Thrills, on my shelf. And I did a bonus episode. I don't know if you know this, someone translated, and a company, I think it's a company that specializes in manga, published a manhwa adaptation of one of his stories. The English title they went for is, oh God, what is it? It's like Wild Animals.
Yeah, this is 动物凶猛.
Yeah. There's a manhwa, I guess in Chinese and in English, that is out there. I God knows how many people have read it.
Yeah, no, I did a lot of research on 动物凶猛 because it's such a good novella. And after having zero luck contacting the author of 空中小姐, I was just rabid for something more saleable that would bring a US publisher sort of into my corner. And 动物凶猛 is very definitely that piece. They published the English language translation most recently was published in Canada. And this was the better part of, I want to say 10 years ago. But of course, it was adapted into an incredibly famous film, right?
Yeah.
Voiced over by Jiangnan, In the Heat of the Sun, which is absolutely brilliant. I want to say 5th generation Chinese cinema. I might be wrong. A film person will correct me there.
We do have at least one Chinese cinema expert who listens. So Maya, if you're listening, let us know if we've got our numbers right for the generations.
I can never remember. In any case, 动物凶猛 is, in my opinion, the best of Wang Shuo's shorter fiction. And it always burned me that I was never able to connect with the author, the piece, and bring that to a US publisher in time.
Do you think it was hard to get to him because he's been kind of, I don't, censored is maybe slightly too strong, but he was a bit of a operating on the edge, seems to have either quietened or been quietened. Do you think that's why he was hard to get to, or am I reading too much into it?
I think it's partly that, and partly personality based. Wang Shuo doesn't like to be contacted by the people whom he does not know. He lives, last I knew, he lived in Los Angeles.
Oh, right.
And it remains in contact with only a small number of people. A couple of his erstwhile friends gave me cell phone numbers that never worked. So
throwing you off the track.
Never going to be. Yeah, well, I don't know. Yeah, maybe, definitely. But geez, I can never tell. I couldn't absolutely never tell. Run around after Wang Shuo is ridiculous.
Running around after Wang Shuo would be a good name for a novel, actually. Yeah.
With a Wang Shuo-esque protagonist.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we've been talking enough about Wang Shuo. We should get to our author for today, who I mentioned is Ge Fei. And my first set of questions aren't specifically about our book for today, Peach Blossom Paradise. I actually want to talk about the trilogy that Peach Blossom Paradise is part of, and this is for basically selfish reasons. It's called the Jiangnan Trilogy, and anyone who's listened to, probably if you listen to a scattershot of the show's episodes, listeners would have heard me, rambling on about one of the handful of sort of, I don't know, buzzwords that I obsess over from Chinese, and Jiangnan is one of them. So rather than me rattling off my understanding of it for the nth time, could you tell the listeners, what does Jiangnan mean to you, and what is its significance in this trilogy by Ge Fei?
Absolutely. So Jiangnan is a historical cultural complex within the sort of imagined gestalt of China as a historical entity. That's a lot of $100 words to tell you.
Good use of them, though.
To say that it refers to a region of the mind as well as a region of the earth. So Jiangnan, literally meaning south of the river, means south of the Changjiang, south of the Long River. And it refers to that area beginning at its northern edge with the Yangzhou region on the southern border of the Long River and moving south and mostly southeast. Jiangnan is historically one of the two breadbaskets of China. Surely it is the site of the most arable and productive land in China in the pre-modern era. Throughout the pre-modern age. It is lowland. It's the land of rice, right? And here we have, if you ever look at a map of China, you will discover that of its massive landmass, only some incredibly small percentage is arable, is in fact amenable to high density farming. And the Jiangnan area really is that area. And historically speaking, for a number of different reasons, it has fostered a separate culture of its own. It has fostered a separate culture and regional identity of its own. It is home to several of the most famous metropolitan cities. In the contemporary age, we think of Shanghai first. But long before Shanghai, there was Hangzhou, and there was Suzhou, and there was Yangzhou. I mean, these are cities from time immemorial that have been sites of business, pleasure, short-term imperial governments. They are the homelands of incredibly famous poets, writers, scholars, painters. Suzhou and Hangzhou in particular have had that reputation, right? The Chinese phrase, 上有天堂,下有苏杭, right? There's heaven up above and Suzhou and Hangzhou on earth.
Yeah.
Is part of this. And at the same time, while this region has become famous for the bounty of its harvests, the beauty of its women, the talent of its poets, the incredible views and pleasures of its metropolises, it's also been this weird sort of otherized place for imperial governments and cultures to run to when the North was invaded by pick your barbarian tribe.
Right.
And I use
Yeah.
the word barbarian in quotes because they were thought of as barbarians by the Central Han. For instance, when the Song Dynasty capital was destroyed by the Jurchens, they moved provisionally to Hangzhou, right? And it was thought that amid the beauties of Hangzhou, that the dynasty continued to wither and die. Something similar happened to the Ming dynasty when they were driven out of Beijing by the Manchurians, when they were driven out of Beijing by the Manchus. They moved to Nanjing, and in the southern environment, the last scions of the Ming court essentially abnegated their responsibilities and the dynasty died. Lastly, and this is most important for Gefe himself, the cities of Jiangnan, of the south, have a reputation for porousness. Their boundaries were fairly open. There was a significant amount of ebb and flow of people and goods from the countryside into the city. Green spaces that we normally associate with the country migrated into the city in the form of scholar gardens and parks. And the people from the city often moved out of the countryside and spent lots of time out in the countryside. There was a back and forth, an ebb and flow, a sort of organic feeling to it that Gefe himself has talked about, especially when he starts comparing it to the commercial monolith that is Shanghai.
Right, that's interesting. When you were recounting all the things about Suzhou and Hangzhou, and I'm not going to be able to rattle it off, but that phrase about heaven above, Suhang below, I think it was. That's stirring a lot of memories for me. Partly because the time in China I spent, most of it was in Shanghai, so I was often taking the chance to scoot south to Hangzhou or west to Suzhou. But my very first year in China was spent in Zhejiang, in just Deqing, just one of the counties in the sort of halfway between Hangzhou and Huzhou. And yeah, everything you were saying was bringing back memories of that. Where was I going with that? Oh, yes. So the point you made about porousness, I'd never thought about that before, but it rings really true, actually, in my memories of Hangzhou, because so obviously Hangzhou has the West Lake in it. So it's this pretty modern Chinese city, but right about in one of its dead centers anyway, there's this incredible, very large ancient man-made lake. But over on its west side, you have mountains and hills. There's the Longjing tea village, and yet it's still like a city. And I mean, I suppose, yeah, I'd never seen anything like that before. Even in my own country, where you suppose, supposedly a place of great natural beauty, and the city that is where I grew up and where I am right now, Dundee, we're really quite close to the Highlands. You can catch a Dundee bus up there and get there in something like an hour. I talked about riding that bus in the episode on Radish by Mo Yan, but there isn't like a blurring between the two. You just you pass out of the suburbs and then you're going through the countryside, and then you're either going one way into inland, another way along the coast, or north, eventually heading for the glens. There is no sort of mistaking one for the other, at least that I can think of. And I can't think of seeing much of that in any other place in China I've been, now that you mention it. So yeah, that's interesting. I can't think exactly how that relates to anything I've read by Ge Fei, but maybe I missed it. Can you think of a way it relates to Peach Blossom Paradise?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, there is the porousness and organic fluidity that I speak of, and that Gefe has spoken of, resonates, and we see its undertones in the attempted creations of various kinds of utopia within Peach Blossom Paradise, which is really what this novel is about. It's not the only thing it's about, but it's one of the major themes. And in particular, the Bandit Haven of Huajiashe, which is the title of the second part of the novel, describes a human settlement that has been integrated into the natural flow of sunlight and wind and water to the best of the architect's ability.
Right. Yeah, it's a town, but at least when I was reading it, I was visualizing it as a town sort of out of the way, not quite out of the way, and by a lake. So yeah. Now you mention it, yes. Maybe was in my mind I was visualizing it more as a village than something urban. Maybe that's.
Oh, definitely a village. Right. Most definitely a village. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to suggest that it was a city.
Right.
But it is. He describes the organization of waterways, right, that send running water to every house in the village. It's interesting, of course, because one of the great tensions in that novel is between man-made space and man-made. I should say it this way. One of the great tensions in the novel is between man-made enclosed spaces and open traversable spaces. So we notice, for instance, that dangerous things cross the open spaces in Peach Blossom Spring. People appear out of nowhere. Fires start. Boats come from across the lake. Qing Dynasty officials ride over the plains to cut people's heads off. A spy travels through the fields and the woods to spy on local villagers who are fomenting rebellion, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, we have the spaces of like the covered walkway at Huajiashe. We have the Liu family estate with its outer wall in the first and last parts of the book. And we notice how that space starts to tumble down. So there's a really tense relationship between an interior and exterior that happens.
I was going to ask you a question later about how we could try and connect this novel with the other Gefe story we covered on the podcast, Flock of Brown Birds. And now you mention it, something has occurred to me, which I guess it registered unconsciously, but now I've got a way to articulate it. Reading Flock of Brown Birds, the character literally can't really he says something like either time is broken in some way or my memory's blocked. So the whole thing you read the whole thing in a kind of a haze, never knowing what's, at least in terms of space, what's very far beyond this guy in his house or the dark roads he's walking down, literally and figuratively. And you don't know really what's ahead or behind him in time as well. And yeah, what you said about the settled spaces and the places in between them in Peach Blossom Paradise, it's totally true. So I don't know if this would interest you at all. It might interest some listeners. I've been playing one of the Witcher games. Me and my girlfriend got an old Xbox One recently, secondhand. Wow. And it's one of these fantasy games where you have a great big map and you can explore it. And as you explore it, you find more things. But, it'd be a boring fantasy game if there was nothing, or a boring RPG if there was no monsters between the towns. So you wander around, you don't know what's going to be around the corner, and it's usually something that will try and kill you. Or if it won't kill you, it will give you a surprise. And it, any of these games has a fog around your, you have a certain circumference around yourself. Yeah, around your, or on the map, the little mini map at the top right of your screen, you have where you are. Everything in a certain proximity to you is revealed, but almost like 99% of the world, it's blacked out. You don't really know what's going on. And yeah, although the setting of Peach Blossom Paradise it's a more or less real historical China, it's got a feeling of being a very strange, mysterious place. Maybe aided by the fact no one's got telephones or smartphones or TV or radio. So it's quite a natural sort of, how would you know what was going on in most of the world, even in a fairly, in the Qing Dynasty, which was, not exactly medieval times, but even then they were clearly confusing times.
Sure, absolutely. And one of the things that we see in a number of Gefe's work is a penchant to imagine semi-connected, semi-realist spaces that are often haunting in their isolation. this happens. This is how I feel the home setting to be in Flock of Brown Birds is how I feel multiple spaces exist in Peach Blossom Paradise, and it's most certainly something that we see in the Invisibility Cloak,
which you also translated.
Yep, several years ago.
Yeah, that one, as I was reading it, I was like, aha, this is Ge Fei writing some sort of naturalistic realist thing. And then it got near the end and I was like, wait a minute, this got weird, and I didn't even see it creeping up on me until it's too late.
Yep. He's impossible to classify in that respect. And that really is true. Even though Peach Blossom Paradise is in a number of ways very much participates in the sort of like doorstop length epic historical fiction novel that many writers of his generation have tried their hand at, there is still a semi-mystical, half unreal touch to it.
Yeah, it's very subtle. This was going to be another one of my questions further down the little PDF I made of questions, but it's worth mentioning now. So yeah, in my personal journey and on the podcast, reading all these translated Chinese books, quite a lot of the sort of doorstop historical stories you described are out there, and they're usually a recounting of the various stages of modern Chinese history. The characters go through various traumas. It's a bit cyclical in that sense, and I'm gonna have to get my exact wording because it's a quite specific thought. Just scroll down to the correct question. Yeah, so one the common theme I noticed and then had my suspicions confirmed. I was reading some like academic secondary criticism, not in the sense of criticism in the academic sense, like someone writing
secondary scholarship.
There you go. Someone in their secondary scholarship. I think it was actually in prep for this book confirmed my sort of intuition. So the feeling I got from a lot of these big, serious Chinese novels, which seem to be so popular, and at least with publishers in translation, is something like life is absurd and chaotic. Both individual life plans and collective pushes for progress, which are quite significant in 20th century China, are doomed to unintended consequences and gradual dissipation. And one thought I had was it's a way to not make a direct critique about any particular ideology. If you just say something like life is it's a mire, or life is pointless, or humans are foolish, or whatever. And as I was starting on this book, I was like, oh man, it wasn't something I was certain about, but I had a worry at the back of my mind that, oh no, he's turned from a very kind of interesting surreal modernist that I read in Flock of Brown Birds to a fairly generic, serious Chinese novelist. But I feel that worry was dissipated a bit because, yeah, it does something a bit different. It's very subtle. The kind of mysteriousness is there at a lower level. And also, this book's not actually that huge.
Right.
It took me a bit of a while to get through, right? I didn't start to read it very quickly until maybe like close to the halfway point. So it's not a teeny novel, but it's not a great monster either.
Absolutely. In terms of scale, the single volume is much less than a number of the massive historical tomes that, it's like Zhang Wei's You Are on the Plane, it's like Gao Yuan, which is several million characters, or any number of Mo Yan's novels, including Life and Death Are Wearing Me Out. Or Jia Pinghua wrote a huge novel called Gulu Cun, which we attempted to sell 10 years ago or so. And in many of those large historical novels feature they foreground the powerless subject amid the mad rush of historical narrative.
Right.
Totally. It's the right. You think of the movie To Live, right? You think of 活着, and I think your description of the individual amidst the current fits perfectly in line with that style of book and later movie. Peach Blossom Paradise is significantly different, and it's interesting that you mentioned having that worry when you started it out, because when I started it out, I had almost exactly the same worry. Having begun my career in Gefe's oeuvre with The Invisibility Cloak and some of his short stories, and knowing him, of course, as one of the leaders of the avant-garde movement in the late 80s and the early 90s, I was surprised to see him wading into the sort of historical subject in the way that he was.
Mm.
But there is an introspective clarity to Peach Blossom Paradise and a darkness in it that are not to be found in, I think, many of the historical fiction, epics of relatively the same time period in Chinese literature. The character of Lu Xiumi, our protagonist, she wanders through certain spaces and experiences certain transformation that are not part of a great historical narrative. They're not allegories for XYZ historical movement or leader or party or whatever.
Right.
They are less than that, and they are also more. And while it's absolutely true that Peach Blossom Paradise describes certain kinds of futility and the best made plans of mice and men gang after glay type thing, at the same time, this is a much more conflicted, subconsciously involved kind of futility and frustration. This is not the husband and wife with the pregnant daughter who can't get a doctor because he's been starving. This is not that plot. There is something more sinister and more mythical at work.
Yeah, one of the two, I think it was either two or three, I'm going to say two, one of the two pieces of secondary reading I did, it was just, grabbed off of JSTOR or somewhere like that. It was a essay it was using a literary theory. I forget what its exact name is, something like fictional minds, which sounds like it could mean just about anything, but it's an interesting framing of looking at a piece of fiction where you analyze it in terms of to what extent does the text create a sort of virtual personality, particularly specifically their mind, be it their conscious or their unconscious, I guess. And that, sometimes reading an essay can make the book interesting, but kind of flattens it into politics or history or something. And sometimes an academic essay in a book is just lame and you get nothing out of it. This one made me, I think it enhanced it just on like a literary level, looking back at it and thinking, oh yeah, he did use technique X, Y, and Z. He wasn't just writing a yarn. And I think the essay talked mostly about Xiumi and her mind. And without trying to spoil anything, we start off the book in her head, but we're not always in her head for the entirety of the book. But even when we're not in her head, there are things going on either in her conscious mind, but we don't see it because we're not getting that perspective anymore, or it's going on at some unconscious level and she's going through changes that she doesn't even understand. And then as the unconscious does, it bubbles up later. And although it's not written explicitly anywhere, it's not described explicitly, but somewhere under the hood, so to speak, somewhere in the planning or in the thinking of Gefe, he's made at least this one character, maybe other ones, a pretty interesting simulated virtual personality.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah, there you go. It's striking actually how fruitful some of these, like what you'd think would be a cheesy sci-fi terminology, simulation or virtual, but it's fiction is representational. It's always, at least if it's realist, it's simulating something.
Absolutely. And the best literary criticism, the real literary scholarship, is simple words that change the way you read. And it really can do that when it's done right.
Yeah, totally. Another thing I found that makes me a really engaged, close reader is if I really obsess over a book and start rereading it and rereading it. I don't know if I've ever talked about this on the show or if it's too. I don't know. I know I've talked about this recently, but I found it's a little bit like watching a scene in a movie over and over and over. You'll see things in the background, or you'll see extras' faces, or in a book, you'll be able to, when you're, in my experience anyway, when you're reading fiction, you have a fuzzy picture of what a place should look like. But if you are really engaged and the author has given you a reasonable amount of stuff to work with, you'll be able to create, again, an amazing virtual place. And where am I going with this? And you can end up with something that God knows if the author intended it. But I get the sense you could probably do that with this book. I get the sense there's a lot of hidden details, or just details I didn't pick up on my first reading.
Oh, absolutely. And a plethora of visual imagery. It's interesting. I translated a huge piece of this novel in a painting studio.
Right.
My girlfriend was in the MFA program at RISD at the time, and I used to sit in my rocking chair in her studio while she made art, and I would translate a chapter and then I would read it to her aloud. And she made the very interesting observation very, very early on at how visually rich and textured Gefe's prose is. And I hadn't noticed it because I'm not an image person, I'm a words person. But as she heard it, like it's extremely, the mind's eye is richly stimulated by this narrative.
Definitely. I remember, I think I felt that most strongly with Flock of Brown Birds, but maybe that's because he's a younger writer. It has images that kind of call for you to visualize them because they're so strange. Whereas in Peach Blossom Paradise, it's a fairly naturalistic setting. But the richness of the physical things is totally there. Rewinding slightly to what you said, or what we were talking about worrying that he was settling down as a more generic, in quotes, important Chinese writer. It struck me while you were talking that there's a little bit of a sweet spot in, I think, in books and in films, where someone who's a little, a bit of a master with their own particular artistic vision, who's figured themselves out as a writer or a director or whatever, away from the norm, doing artsy stuff or non-mainstream stuff or whatever, when they, I guess, in either they get, like, if it's a director, perhaps they'll sign up for something with a big studio because they want to do something, or because they want the money, who knows? Or if an author just decides to write a book that's more in maybe genre conventions, it can either be very disappointing and lame, or it can fall in a sweet spot of something that has all the strengths of whatever pre-made slot that they're falling into, but then their own particular strength of their vision. I'm trying to bring out my higher dollar value words today to keep up with you, but like the one that's I guess the first example that pops into my head is Christopher Nolan doing a Batman movie, and I remember like seeing posters for that as a kid and thinking, oh man, are they really making more Batman films? Who cares? And my dad was like, yes, but you see, son, it's Christopher Nolan, he's a great director. And I was like, I don't care, it's another Batman film. They made one like 5 years ago, why are they making more? And that trend at least has continued. But it was at least one of the films in that trilogy is one of the best ones, or at least in the eyes of many critics and myself. That's an incredible number two. I mean, I like the other ones, but number two is really something special. And it's like what we were saying, it's you could, I think you could watch that one 10 times and still miss stuff. It's very multi-layered, as well as having a pretty singular vision coded there between the lines of your superhero movie. But I should probably. We've had a lot of talk of video games and superhero movies. I'm trying to stay serious.
Well, I'm sorry. What was the question that was behind this piece? I'm not quite sure.
What was the question? Oh, it was more of an observation. Can I turn it into?
Oh, I see. I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I might have said, "Here's a question," and then I didn't come up with the question. I do that quite a lot. It would if I was doing that to you at an author or translator event, then I'd be the biggest asshole. But I'm the host of a podcast, so I can get away with it.
You do whatever you want.
Exactly. So here's a serious question, and we were kind of touching on this. Aside from everything is futile, what can we say about the politics in the book? If it has a position, maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't have a particular position, then what can we say otherwise about the politics in the book?
So the politics as an atmosphere, politics as a world are a part of this book that absolutely cannot be missed, because this book, like the other two books in the trilogy, is positioned in a political liminal space.
Right.
Okay. In this case, it is the aftermath of the 1898 100 Days Reform, which is one of the most important and most easily forgotten periods of modern Chinese history, in which a group of progressive intellectuals who were also government officials wrested control of the government for 3.5 months and attempted to create an egalitarian democracy in China, like just in the middle of the end of the Qing dynasty. And this was a time of massive political upheaval, of military defeat, of economic uncertainty, in which a small group of people who believed fervently in the idea of the, quote, great unity, which is mentioned a couple of times in the narrative, essentially tried to build a utopia out of nothing, a modernist utopia out of nothing, and they failed. And the people inside that project, both the people who tried to replicate it and the people who freeloaded on it and the people who actively opposed it, found themselves in utterly new territory.
Yeah.
And it took a lot of lives.
I wonder how well it compares to like the kind of tail end of the 60s, early 70s, the tail end of the hippie dream, because I'm thinking of one or two male characters in early on in the book who are, or actually no, more than one or two, who are or have been somewhat tied to these like progressive or revolutionary ideals you're describing, and they end up just kind of being like, I don't know, a predatory free love guy from the early 70s. They're quite happy to use the ideas that suit their baser desires, I guess. And we've got the sense that there was something a little bit more enlightened not that long ago in the past, but the high ideas die more easily than the brutish ones, I suppose.
Well, it is the scene which Peach Blossom Paradise describes is one in which private motive and public mission cover each other up very well. And this is, that's probably more of a truism than it sounds like, even as this is the case with many movements of great political change the world over.
It sounds kind of like life as well.
Yeah, they're hijacked almost immediately.
Yeah.
But in this case, there's such a feeling of discontinuity, of like potentially tectonic break with a system of government and social organization that has persisted for, well over a millennium. That characters like Zhang Jiyuan they describe a sort of, how do I want to put this, brutal, take no prisoners, and merciless energy of reform.
Yeah, there's
right.
I don't know if there's a better word than bloodthirsty, but like the idea of like taking lives for revolution is part of the virtue of the whole thing. Like, I'm sure a few characters that guy we meet early on, Zhang Jiyuan, and some others, someone asked them what is revolution about, and what we'd think would there be something we'd expect to hear something like democracy, liberty, equality, fraternity, da da da. But it's like, no, it's about killing people. That's how you get stuff done. You kill people. What for? Well, just to be revolutionary. But why do you do that? Circular logic.
That's right. And this is that kind of revolution, that idea, simplistic idea of revolution is simply cutting people's heads off. We see echoed throughout the major revolutionary movements of Chinese history. I mean, that's the basic equation that's grabbed a hold of during the Cultural Revolution.
I mean, this is going to sound a bit silly, but when I have a day of work ahead of me, the work I like best is the stuff that gives me a clear sense I'm getting something done. Ideally, something fairly simple, repetitive that I am in particular quite good at. And if you were revolutionary, killing people might feel like one way of getting things done, particularly if they're somehow labelable as undesirable. I'm going to steer us backwards slightly because there's something I've been meaning to say. You mentioned the 100 Days Reform, and that's mentioned on the book's blurb. The book's got a really interesting blurb because it's pretty long, and it's pretty unafraid of getting into like historical context and big ideas as well as just hooking the story. Maybe that's because it's a NYRB book and that's part of the style. But I don't know if you were involved in the blurbing at all. It occurred to me.
I wrote the blurb.
Right. Okay.
I wrote the rough draft for the blurb, and then my editor-in-chief, who is amazing, rewrote it.
Yeah. An interesting peek behind the scenes there. But I'm wondering, is the first paragraph, is that going to be the same for every book in the trilogy, and then the second paragraph is specific for each book?
That depends on knowability of the period being described.
Right. Okay.
Right. Translations are crafted with the target audience in mind. You will find if you talk to more than a few young Chinese people today that they don't know what the 100 Days Reform is.
Sure.
Let alone your average English language reader who speaks no Chinese and has, no reliable training in Chinese history.
Sure.
So it becomes necessary to set the stage as concisely as possible before we move on to the book. I don't think the same will be necessary for the second and especially not the third, which are set much closer to our time.
Right. Okay. Makes sense. Anyway, the question, or not a question, the open-ended sort of statement I was going to throw in your direction. I was going to note that the 100 Days Reform is mentioned and described and put in context in the blurb, but in the book itself, unless I missed it, the 100 Days Reform isn't named in the book, but we are dealing with people who were quite possibly involved with it back in the day. Do you think that's, you just mentioned that younger Chinese people, plenty of them maybe don't know about this particular episode in history. Do you think this is a difference between the English edition and the Chinese edition, that Ge Fei would know, that a lot of his readers would know that's the particular event we're in the aftermath of, and in the English edition we need it in the blurb? Or is it more that the milieu is the thing that the English language readers need to be clued into, rather than?
I think Ge Fei would have presumed that his original readers would have at least been able to identify the historical period. But I also think if we look at his technique for description and the choices that he makes, who to narrate, how to narrate it, who to follow. For instance, if you were someone who was interested in sort of the greatest hits of Chinese history, and you were interested in reading a novel that jived with that narrative, you wouldn't read this novel, because it's a Xiumi is a person who lives and dies in semi-silence.
Right.
Right? I mean, there's seclusion, isolation, self-isolation, and self-prohibition are hugely active parts of this book. And it's not like, we don't meet any Sun Yat-sens, we don't meet any Mao Zedongs.
No.
He is filling in, he's bringing light to an extremely dark corner of the sort of modern historical narrative.
Right.
So it seems to me fairly clear that while he knows his audience knows something, he's more banking on that there's a bunch of stuff they don't know.
Yeah, I can think of equivalent narratives in other countries and other places where, although we remember the revolution that, produced a new order and won, lots of revolutions can be put down beforehand. Like maybe France as an example. We all think the French Revolution is the first, French Revolution, but there were plenty that didn't get off the ground, and that and the characters in those stories aren't a million miles away from some of the characters we meet in Beach Blossom Paradise.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We've been going for a while now, so let's charge on. Let's charge on to the story in particular rather than just the whole trilogy. We've kind of hinted at a few things, but if we could go into like maybe plot and characters, the less away from the lofty ideas towards the specifics. What's Peach Blossom Paradise all about?
Well, it's the story of one young woman from a wealthy family in southern China who spends her entire life struggling to maintain control over her own life, both her future and even her body. She is born into a very traditional wealthy family, one that has all of the trappings of wealth that as it was distributed throughout the civil service, and which runs according to traditional Neo-Confucian rules. But all of that comes to nothing when she is kidnapped. And her kidnapping is the first in a series of dislocations that take her first away from her home, and then presumably as far away as Yokohama in Japan, before coming back to her native village to attempt to institute an instant modernization, which is something of a farce and something of a tragedy. And it is at the end of that dream when it comes crashing down at the hands of nepotistic late Qing dynasty officialdom. I guess this is the beginning of the Republican era, so early warlord era / Republican era corruption. When those figures bring her down, she is forced once again to withdraw into herself. And it is in her complete self-withdrawal, the sort of hermitage at the end of the story, that we begin to see the lights of the next novel sort of being shown to us.
What you were saying about how we kind of, towards the end of the book, the next stage of modern Chinese history is arriving, and a lot of our characters meet their fate one way or the other as it arrives. There's an interesting thing that in the English edition, it's footnotes. I think you've got a little translator's note that explains how it is in the original, but I'll just refer to them as footnotes. There's little footnotes that kind of tell you what happened, what the character went on to do or what happened to them. So something like a slightly more classy literary equivalent of what those old like 80s and 90s TV shows and movies used to do, where it'll show you the character's face and be like, Jim Jones went on to blah, 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 blah. Something like that. But Gefei's doing something a little bit more interesting because he's, I guess you can't call it alternate history, but he's playing with real history and his fictional creations. Quite interesting. Is there anything you could say about that? Yeah,
absolutely. There's something important that needs to be said about that. Those are quote unquote author's notes.
Right.
If we were to be, hair-splittingly accurate about this, then we would call them narrator's notes, because they are written in the voice of the speaker, the narrator of the novel. But they're doing exactly what you said they were doing. They're playing with history. This is fake history, right? We're following fictional characters into a real sounding space. So when we have the history of Tiger or when we have, the male character near the end of the book, or when we have the history of Black Dragon Temple, which he extends into the communist era and the modern day. These are all places, and he's made them sound so realistic.
Totally, yeah.
Including the painting, right? The Peach Blossom Paradise painting in the beginning of the book, which is sort of like the beginning of everything, right?
Mm-hmm. It kind of reminds me, I can't think of specific examples, but maybe something along the lines of you go into a movie, you stick on a movie, and you know that it's done in a fake documentary style, or it's going to say on a screen on a panel based on a true story, but it's just an affectation. It's totally not real, but then you find yourself halfway through, you're second guessing yourself, like, oh wait, no, did this really happen? And that's kind of what happened to me. I read your translator's note explaining what these footnotes were going to be, and I was like, it's just a silly game Ge Fei's playing. But then I read one or two of them and was like, wait, so are these real places he's taken from history and put in his book? And yeah, it's sort of uncanny. It's not. I went in thinking that this might be a bit cheesy. This might seem like he didn't need to do it, and it's self-indulgent. But yeah, however, in whatever way he did it, it blurs the line between fiction and reality quite nicely.
Exactly.
Yeah. What other sort of literary techniques is he deploying in the book?
Well, I'd love to be able to rattle off a list of, standard literary critical terms here. But
well, as we said earlier, the terms don't make the strength of the commentary. It's the
absolutely not. Yeah. And I mean, there is a significant amount of simultaneous or non-consecutive narration that goes on. So he makes frequent use of things like the flashback. We notice that it's used to sort of secondary narrative from other characters' mouths is a staple of the second part of the book, as we hear about, we hear important events retold more often than we see them being enacted,
right?
Especially when she's at Huajiashe. Other than that, I have
one. I mean, I noticed repetition was interesting. Things repeat, but it's in a very particular way. So thinking of another author who uses repetition right off the top of my head, I've read his Song of Ice and Fire series books twice, George R. R. Martin. So venturing back into nerdy fantasy territory, he has these phrases that pop up again and again, which I guess are a part of making the world seem like a real world. They do sometimes have some sort of deeper significance. Like there's one which becomes more and more prevalent as the war turns the country to shit. It's words are wind. And that one's actually quite good, because the idea is society is being unraveled by the war. Society is built on what promises we make each other. Money's based on a promise of, getting something in return. Words have lost their value because society's falling apart. Words are wind. But it's repeated very frequently, so you can never forget it. Whereas the stuff that repeats in Peach Blossom Paradise, it's, from what I noticed, it's frequent enough that you'll notice something is reappearing, but it's spaced out enough and subtle enough that the cause and effect between the two is not non-existent, but is not clear cut either. And I think that's really quite good, because that's how life works. Usually when something pops up again, you can't always that there's some kind of cause and effect, but it might be very fuzzy, or that even if there is a clear chain of things that have gone from A to B, you're never going to be able to trace them because they're so interconnected and confusing. And life's like that. And I think that's why life foils us so often. We can't possibly keep tabs on everything that happens when we're not looking, or, that might feed into what you said about how we're always hearing about things secondhand, because our Xiaomi or we, the observer or the narrator, can't be privy to everything at the same time. And there's all these things written in between the lines. So yeah, I'm running out of breath,
absolutely.
so I can't keep that thought going.
No, I absolutely agree, and I hadn't thought of that, but there are multiple kinds of repetition that are very consciously at play here, both on the verbal level as people repeat things. There's a sort of a feeling of aphorism. The How do I put this? The questionable maxim returns again and again and again, particularly while she's at Huajiashe and then after. Just as the motif of the Peach Blossom Paradise, the traditional utopia written by Tao Yunming, appears again and again. Certain phrases, Han Yu, the nun, the ex-Buddhist nun who Xiumi lives on the island with in Huajiashe, has tons of phrases like that she repeats over and over and appear to make sense to her, but in the greater scheme of things, they feel fragile. Meanwhile, obviously, there are certain objects that also appear from time to time and carry this like sort of mysterious weight with them whenever they appear.
And that's another thing that I think reflects life. A thing I think that's come up on some of the modernist, actually in the last episode, the TrChFic episode, we were talking about how in literary modernism or any kind of modernist art, you take a non-realistic approach and it actually describes reality better than realism does, because reality is, for lack of a better word, very strange and fragmented. Life isn't as neat and tidy. If you actually think about life, it's not nearly as neat and tidy as it appears to be on the surface. So yeah, like the thing of people constantly throwing out questionable statements that they seem to believe in very earnestly. Yeah, it's all over the book, and it might seem a bit of an affectation, but almost every day I hear someone do the same thing. I've just remembered, I tell this story a lot. I don't think I've told it on the show. So my old job in Shanghai, I was in an international division of a school, and I had one of my bosses who was a foreign guy, living in China, an American living in China who didn't want to go back. And who knows why, he came up to me and one of the other younger teachers. We weren't talking about anything very heavy. I think it was just literature. And he just throws out, so America's a fascist country, right? And then keeps going. I'm like, well, you could make the argument, but what? But he just, you make the bold statement, you say right, and then you keep going. And what are you going to do? Be like, well, actually, here's my counter argument. No, you just have to roll with people saying their slightly eccentric beliefs, and then you move on. You forget that it happened.
Well, that's, heaven knows in the time of social media and in the age of Donald Trump, we see a lot of people believing that they are individuals saying the same damn thing over and over again. The consequences of the sort of characteristics and consequences of groupthink of various kinds get, they show up pretty starkly.
My favorite internet aphorism of the last few years is, surely this will stop Donald Trump.
Yeah, right.
Just keep that thought in your head when you scroll through Twitter. It's very entertaining.
Yeah.
If only every tweet on Twitter was an aphorism, then it would be way more, if it read quite, as lots of punchy statements and not links and hashtags and quotes and stuff.
I feel like part of the issue with Twitter is that people are trying to sound aphoristic when they tweet. One of the reasons I left it. Right.
Yeah, I think that was me. That was me on Facebook when I was for age 17 through to like 21 or 22. I thought I was very good at writing powerful or hilarious statements, but then I guess by the time I hit 22, I was able to look back and see the ones from when I was 17 and be like, oh no, I'm still doing this.
Mm-hmm.
At least I wasn't calling for murder, though, just revolution.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, let's keep going. Let's go away from internet rage and go on to drier stuff, publishing and translation. Our English title is Peach Blossom Paradise, which is, I think, similar, unless I'm wrong here, similar but not quite the same as the original Chinese title. So what can you tell listeners about the original Chinese title and also your translation of it and how you know.
Absolutely. I can tell you that my editors and I went back and forth on the title of this novel for literally months, because, of course, the original Chinese 4-character phrase 人面桃花, literally people's faces peach blossoms. A, does not translate word for word into English.
Right.
B, comes from a classical Chinese poem in which like many Chinese poems, works using disjunction and partial symbolism. So your first 2 lines of that particular poem, 此年此日此门中人面桃花相映红, that is, on this year, I'm sorry, 去年此日此, yeah, of course, last year, on this day, within this doorway, so within this gate, the woman's face and the peach blossoms smiled red to each other, reflected red to each other. And it describes a young man who sort of, met a woman inside, a young lady, or saw a young lady inside some beautiful villa, and she was blushing and gorgeous, and the peach blossoms were blushing and gorgeous, etc. And then he comes back a year later to discover 人面不知何处去. I don't know where the woman's face went, so she's gone. 桃花依旧笑春风. So the peach blossoms, just as always, smile at the spring breeze. So it's about the passing of time, the ephemerality of love and beauty.
Right.
And there's no way that you get that into English without sounding corny as hell. The Chinese title is not corny. And really, when we talk about translation, a lot of what we're talking about is the translation of context, right? The impression created by language. And that has as much to do with the context, the sort of reception context of the original, the source text, as it does with anything else. So there is a significant distinction. We went back and forth with metaphorical titles and, variants of the original. When this novel was first partially translated, and the sort of first push to get this novel translated began, which is probably the better part of 20 years ago now. It was the translator simply translated it as beauty. That was the whole thing.
Interesting.
And well, I understand why, but you can your reaction, which was also my reaction, sort of describes why that translation we believed was not feasible.
Right.
So, we went back and forth, and what we decided on, this title, Peach Blossom Paradise, blends both how do I want to put this? It blends specific reference to the Chinese title with specific reference to the myth that underlies it. Right. So the myth of the peach blossom spring, the utopia that is found by the fisherman who is following peach blossom petals that are coming downstream, and he follows the stream to a cave, and he goes in the cave and follows it until he comes out the other side, and he finds this timeless utopia in which people don't know what government it is, and everyone loves everyone else. And so the title Peach Blossom Paradise refers to both the poem and to this that I just mentioned, and the ancient tale of paradise on earth.
Perfect. What you mentioned about the English title, or a literal translation of the title just not working at all. It reminded me of how sometimes on original Chinese editions of Chinese books, they'll, for whatever reason, they'll have like the Chinese title and the characters laid out in some interesting way, nice and big, and then they'll have in English, in like Latin alphabet, some kind of an English title, usually a literal or fairly literal title. And I had a vague memory of seeing Peach Blossom with a human face listed as an English title for the book somewhere.
That's horrible.
Yeah, it's scary. It sounds like a horror novel.
What an awful cartoon.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
yeah, they do that all the time. I mean, Chinese publishers are mandated to have English language titles of their books when they report them. This is bound up with all the rules and regulations of the Chinese publishing sphere, and most of the time they come up with these really, really unfortunate versions, like Jia Pingwan's Gulu Cun, Gulu Village. It's literally he titled it like The Story of China or something. There's a journalist named Li Chengpeng who I find amazing and who is now censored all over the place. But he's amazing. He has this incredible book of journalistic nonfiction opinion pieces called 全世界人民都知道, right? Everyone else in the world knows. And his English language title is Smilance.
Smilance.
Yes.
Like trying to turn smile into a
silence.
Noun. Oh.
Like smiling silence.
Oh, you know what? I can see.
And you're just like, oh, dude.
Yeah, it's weird. If you were a Martian coming down from space, you might be like, "Aha, very excellent and cunning use of language." But yeah,
it's about the translation of. It's about knowing how the thing is received,
yes.
Right, and reproducing a context of reception.
Mm-hmm.
If the title is not weird and strange in Chinese, if the title is not uber corny in Chinese, then it shouldn't be weird and strange in English or uber corny in English.
Right, there you go. Yeah, you're reproducing the effect, not necessarily the meaning. Yeah. Right. The end of that story was, as you were talking, I was listening, but I was also Google image searching the Chinese name, and it seems that the publishers. My memory might have been false. I might have seen it on a web page, not a book cover, because all the Latin writing I'm seeing on the Chinese book covers just have the pinyin, Remian Taohua.
So
yep. Choice.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. And next question. No segue. Just the next question. Have you met or communicated much with Ge Fei himself?
Mm-hmm. Yes, he and I have an excellent working relationship.
Awesome.
We started. I met Ge Fei when I audited one of his classes at Tsinghua while I was studying Chinese at an immersive program at Tsinghua University where he teaches, and I met someone who was one of his students, and she took me to listen to one of his classes. Later, when Eric and I were trying to get Paper Republic going as a rights representation agency and like a publishing consulting agency in the, I guess, 2009, 10, and 11. Mm-hmm. 2010 was when the Invisibility Cloak came out, and I just fell in love with that. And we actually were, so we were involved with the marketing of that title to NYRB. And that was when I started talking to Ge Fei. And once I was given the go-ahead to translate the Invisibility Cloak, I did what I needed to do. I wrote down all of my questions and confusions and concerns, and I would email him on a regular basis when I had questions to ask. And he would usually, he'd copy the original email and he'd write in his answers underneath my questions. When we did an event a year or two after the publication of the novel, might have been right around that time, I remember. And he was talking about my translation, and he said, I loved working with him because he was always asking me questions. Mm. He'd be like, "What's this mean? What's this mean?" And he actually, Ge Fei noted that I actually I caught a couple of inconsistencies.
Right.
In the prose itself, and he compared this to other translations that have been done of his work, where in which the foreign rights for the novel were sold, and the translator never contacted him, and all of a sudden, 18 months or whatever later, this version of his book comes out, and he has no idea what's in it.
Right, and he's got no one to chase up, or at least no rapport with the person he can chase up.
Exactly, and the rapport is really important. Like having an organic connection to the translator is important. So he and I did a couple of events for Invisibility Cloak back when people could go out to bars and events, and unfortunately we haven't had the chance to do any kind of publicity for Peach Blossom Paradise. But I have, when I was last in China in 2019, I did a I did a lecture with him and a translation workshop with his students
Cool.
over there at the fiction center at Tsinghua that they have. And so, he and I, like, we communicate when we have stuff to talk about. It's great. He's extremely communicative. He's very open. He's a super nice guy. And yeah, it's awesome.
Mm. Speaking of maybe not him as a person, but him as a writer, I mentioned sweet spots earlier, and I gave an example of like artistic vision hitting us, our particular artistic vision slotting into a genre and a a commercial or consumable or enjoyable format, and how I really like that stuff. In terms of this podcast, Gefe is in sort of what I think is a sweet spot. Or when I started the podcast, I didn't want to immediately go to the first Chinese writer a list would set you on to, because I think if just gravity is, so to speak, is pulling you, you'll end up looking at like dissident writers. And I haven't, obviously I've got nothing against them, but I wanted to go a little, at least start off going a little bit off the beaten track. But I've kind of found, if you're not, at least in translation, if you're not doing someone who's either a dissident like Ma Jian, or someone who's a little bit edgy like Wang Shuetsun or Wang Shuo, there'll be quite a lot of stuff which is kind of lame or generic or repetitive or is realist. And realist isn't a dirty word, but it's not my favorite style of thing to read. And Gefe is pretty singular, at least in all the authors I've covered. He's a guy that I could read for pleasure. There's books I've read for the podcast which I've enjoyed, but I don't know if enjoying it or appreciating it is quite the same as getting actual, being like, wow, this is great. I'm appreciating this as a piece of literature, not just as a piece of Chinese literature. That seems cheesy and it doesn't capture entirely what I mean. But yeah, he's, if not my favorite, then definitely one of my favorites that I've done for the podcast.
Oh, good.
Yeah, there's something particular about him in the context of everyone else I've read that I like a lot, but it's hard to articulate exactly what I mean.
Sure. And I would note that one of the weird things and great things about Gefe is that he doesn't have a shtick. So he does not adhere to one type of literature he doesn't stay in one track and never venture. He began his career as an avant-gardist, writing stuff like, Remembering Mr. Wu or The Lost Boat or Flock of Brown Birds. Very disjunctive, shattered consciousness, illogical, so frequently irrational prose. He then moved into the trilogy, the Jiangnan trilogy. And then later on, as he continued to write, we have work like The Invisibility Cloak. We have Waiting for the Spring Wind, which is one of his newer books. I believe he's been trying to come out with a new novel over the past couple of years, which has been difficult because of the publishing environment. But his literary eye roves significantly, which is more than we can say for, many writers who sort of, they get a subject or they get a genre and they just do that thing.
Yeah, or they have like an experimental period when they're young, and then they settle into something a little bit more plain, and then that's them. They're good until they retire.
Exactly, and moreover, particularly in Chinese case, and this is my personal opinion. There is a certain group of authors who, once they've become famous enough, they lose the ability to edit, and in part, I think because there are no editors there who feel powerful and confident enough to take a blue pencil to their work, they tend to get extremely verbose.
Right.
Gefe does not do that. One of the incredible things about his work is the more mature it gets, the more succinct and clear it sounds. His voice has been aging like wine, really.
Yeah, it's a thing I've noticed where when I was in the music I listened to, where when I was a teenager, I had fairly teenage tastes, and there was stuff I would run into either as a teen or in my early 20s, and I'd be like, there's something abrasive or pretentious or just inaccessible about this stuff. I don't get it. And yeah, compare my 21-year-old self to me now, in the latter end of my 20s, I've went back to one or two of those albums or songs, and I'm like, oh yeah, this makes more sense to me now. Maybe my nerve endings have just been sufficiently dulled by life that this is the stuff I like now. I mean, I guess it's the same with food. Kids like sweet stuff because their taste buds, it's just the way your taste buds are. You can't blame a kid for not enjoying subtle flavors because adults enjoy subtle flavors. And yeah, if a writer does the same thing where they've preserved the core, but they don't need to be quite so flashy as they get older, it's probably a good sign that they've got something. I guess Tansha, the author we covered in the last episode, she would have called it your light, like the part, your little core nugget that you mustn't let the outside world spoil. He's kept that, so it would seem, but he's refined it so that he can put it into his work without extremely flashy trappings, like a guy whose state of his mind seems to be taken out of a Freudian textbook, like in Flock of Brown Birds. Yeah. And like what you said, if he just kept pumping out kind of creepy, strange stories like Flock of Brown Birds, I'd keep eating them up. But there's something more impressive about a guy who has kept developing and proved, not just proved he can do it, but has kept growing and refining himself as he proves he can do all these different things.
Absolutely. I mean, the best artists always feel the need to be doing something different.
I think you might have touched on this briefly, but is there a particularly interesting story to how the translation of the Jiangnan trilogy came about? Or have we kind of heard the full story?
Well, this book has had a fraught history.
By which do you mean the English translation?
The English translation. I mean the relationship between Renmian Taohua, the Chinese book, and the English language publishing world, because someone has always been after it. 15 years or so ago, a sample was made by a translator who is a wonderful translator and a professor, and submitted for a Penheim translation grant, and it won that grant, and for the excerpt. And then life intervened, and the excerpt went nowhere. But as was frequently the case with a lot of Chinese novels that were blurbed and shopped around in the early days, a lot of excitement was generated. And that excitement created a concomitant disappointment and confusion when nothing happened to the excerpt. Right. So in that context, and this was a time in contemporary Chinese fiction when some people were doing some unethical things with the rights to Chinese novels. So there were no mainland rights agents at that point. No one was formally handling rights distribution in China. It was all, XYZ's editor or cousin or like daughter-in-law who was quote unquote introducing their books, to everyone they could get their hands on. Right. So no rights management, infrastructure, practices, nexuses, like the Wild West sort of. Yeah, exactly. And as in the Wild West, innocent people get shot, metaphorically speaking. Innocent books get shot, and that happened in a number of weird ways. The guy who wrote White Deer Plain, Chen Zhongshi, I've heard of that one, accidentally sold away the French rights to that novel in perpetuity. He signed a contract that he could not read because in French that he could not read because he had people egging him on to do it, and he did not know what was going on. And he signed away the rights to that French rights to that book in perpetuity to Gallimard. And this happened. Similar things happened with a number of Chinese books. There were some shady characters. There were some deals that did not go through, and that really spooked a lot of Chinese authors. Understandably, yeah. Yeah, of course, understandably. And it was in that context that Renmian Taohua had its first failed interaction with the U.S. publishing world. Meanwhile, a number of people who know Chinese literature Can I be annoying and pause you? When was this? When was this exciting / Wild West period? The 90s. The 90s, right. Sorry, please keep going. The 90s.
I was a baby back then, or well, I spent some of the 90s not existing, and then I got to
Right,
join
right.
in
I
19.
get, yeah, I got that impression from you saying, you mentioning Batman Returns as being on when you were a kid.
Yeah,
And I was midway through college when Batman Begins came out. So yes, that was the 90s.
yeah,
And the early 2000s. And so it never, but meanwhile, there were always people reaching after it. And I really wanted to do Invisibility Cloak, and we did it, and it went well. But at the same time, like right when Invisibility Cloak got signed, I could feel, and I started hearing about people starting to make inquiries about Peach Blossom Paradise. And I knew my editor at New York Review Books, Jeffrey Yang, really likes Gefe's fiction, really wanted to do Peach Blossom Paradise. And so luckily, Invisibility Cloak did really well. They communicated, like NYRB communicated with Gefe like very honestly and directly and openly. And I think that really made it easier because we proved that we were trustworthy and we were going to do well by him.
right, yeah,
So it felt really, really good to finally get that book signed. And I had just started my PhD at that point. I had a trip to Japan looming. I needed to get coursework done. I needed to study for my general exams. So I took a summer basically, and I had at least 6 weeks during that summer. The book stayed at about 40%, 30% completion for a while. And then I took a big chunk of a summer and I translated for 6 hours a day. Yeah, it was pretty great. And then of course, like this is the real big difference that when I got the first draft back with my editor's line comments, in terms of track changes, there was an average of 65 changes per page.
65 changes per page. Yikes.
It was huge. I mean, they have, and I've been through, I want to say at least 4 passes with my line editor, with the proofreader, with the copy editor, with the managing editor. I mean, they've been amazing. You should see, like, this is how good books are made. It's not, it's not like an author or a translator creates a perfect thing and it's already perfect and they print it. When nobody edits a translation, you can tell immediately. New York Review of Books, like, they go over everything multiple times, multiple drafts and email conversations and galleys, and just so much work invested in the final product. It's really like the work of many hands.
It occurs to me there's a lot of potential in either direction for a work in translation. It could be kind of like almost machine translated by a translator, never touched again, or misunderstood by a translator, or translated accurately by a translator who isn't a good writer. So and then as a reader, the book's going to be, even if you enjoy the story, you'll be seeing it through like muddy glass, so to speak, if the prose is, if it's not good prose. But then, like you said, there's huge potential for all these steps to be there polishing the glass, if I'm running with that image. But yeah, and I know what you mean. I've read some translated books where it's like, this is slightly, it feels a bit murky, but whatever, there's a good story here somewhere. And then there's other stuff that's like crystal clear. You get the sense it might even be nicer prose than the Chinese original, because it's had that much. It's had people, I guess there's no non-cheesy way to say it, but just paying it lots of attention and really putting their hearts and their focus and blah, 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 blah onto it to make something more polished than an actual non-translated work would be. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, and if you consider that, literally speaking, all we have are the words on the page, right? And we remake the work in our heads from the signs on the page.
Yeah.
A good translation, I mean, people love to talk about transparency in translation, but that's really a sort of patriarchal is the wrong word. It's a sort of it is a sort of patronizing illusion,
right?
Which reduces translation to the status of a necessary service, when in fact the translation is the repurposing and the recreation on a new page.
Right.
But it's not, but the final product of good translation is a sort of polyvocal work, because it will never be anything other than a translation. And yet you will hear a voice, a very, very clear voice, which is not the translator's unadulterated voice. It's the voice that the translator is delivering. So both presences will be there in a really good translation.
For sure. I think I mentioned this, well, it's come up a few times, but I think I devoted a few minutes to talking about this when I was chatting with Chen Fan, one of the times I had an offer on the show about his Waist Tide, or rather Ken Leo's translation of his Waist Tide. And to me, it felt like a very Ken Leo-esque, however he correctly suffixed that. It felt like it was a translation in his style for quite a lot of different reasons that I won't repeat. But I remember when I'd heard Ken or read his writing or heard him talking, or somewhere down the line I've heard him say he has a slightly unconventional opinion that there's something quite cool about translationese, reading a piece of English that is kind of clearly a translation, but that gives it a kind of power because it can still read very smoothly, and it will have qualities that something not translated wouldn't have. And that might particularly apply to like something like Chinese to English, two languages that aren't even on the same language tree, unless you're going, unless the roots run really deep. But it could, like I was trying to say earlier, it could be a complete train wreck, or it could be could produce something really special. And the favorite books I've done on the show are they have a quality to them. Either they read just like I'd read any other book, or there's something special about them that you wouldn't find in other books.
The process of foreignization can be used masterfully as a domestic tool. And if readers who are not familiar with, for instance, Chinese literature, maybe what translationese sounds like in Chinese literature, can always just look to A Clockwork Orange for examples of that, which is interlarded with terms that are mixed from Russian. Right.
I've never actually read it, so I've only seen the film. I can think of something kind of similar, or at least it involves Russian. Have you read the English translation of Cat Country, Mao Chongji by Lao She?
Interesting. I never read the English translation. We did it in the original in David Wong's class 2 years ago.
Oh, right. Do you remember the bits when they're speaking whatever the Pig Latin version is of Marxism?
Yes.
And then the Chinese, I think it's fusuji, is stuck on the end of all the words or something like that.
Yes.
It's really good in the English translation. I'm trying to think of what is something they say. We must practice everybody shares pinksky punksky ponksky or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's like, as the reader, well, maybe I can only speak for myself, but if you know the book's been translated from Chinese, then you would logically, it takes no great logical leap to realize you're reading something that began as Chinese parodying Russian that has been brought into English. So I don't know how you would draw that web of relationships, but yeah, it's done very nicely in a kind of self-reflexive way.
Absolutely, yeah.
He didn't try and make it natural, if that makes sense. Then it works.
Right, because it isn't, right? It doesn't sound natural in the Chinese.
Right. Yeah, that's the point. Okay, we've got nice and technical. Here's just going into me begging for gossip. Can you reveal any secrets or make any promise about the rest of this trilogy in translation?
I cannot.
Well, that is your right.
But if all y'all buy the book, then you can be assured there should be able to be another one. Yeah, and there might just be something somewhere in Peach Blossom Paradise that basically tells you what the next two books are going to be. I think that's fair to say. May or may not be. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, it might not be there. I can't say anything, but I can say it's a great book. And the cover design, and I guess it's got the same sort of advantage that Flock of Brown Birds did, in that it's got the kind of standard Penguin format. This one's got the NYRB format. It's really nice. A thing I noticed, and I guess this would not be your domain, But you know how the NYRB books have the little colored square on the front that has the author's name and your name and the title. I remember seeing in early promo pictures, the box was dark blue, a little bit like it is on the invisibility cloak, but now it's sort of a peach color, and it blends really nicely with the cover art. It's just one of the nicest book color schemes I've seen in ages. And when I shared, when my review copy that I read, thanks NYRB, when it arrived, I took a picture, put it on Instagram, and I guess you can't really call them your listeners if they're your Instagram followers, but the listeners who follow on Instagram, lots of them were like, "Oh, it looks so nice." And I guess it's a chime between the title, Peach Blossom Paradise, and the color scheme. But there's no question there. I guess the question is, isn't it nice?
Yes, it is beautiful. And I absolutely have to give a shout out to the design team at New York Review of Books. I mean, they're just so good. They designed this super cool image for Invisibility Cloak. They found a number of super cool images for Peach Blossom Paradise. They played around with the colors of that text box a couple of times, actually. It was yellow at one point.
Oh no.
No, that was fine too. It was sort of gold.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, they did a bunch of different things with it, and they're just they're better. They're always better than I can even conceptualize. Having absolutely no training in design, it's just like they're super good.
Yeah, they've found exactly the right color codes. I don't know if it's a pure black they've used for the like the title and your name, but the way they've got it, even the black looks luscious. I don't know. I can't put it better than that. But yeah, lovely book design. That was the last publishing and translation question. We're now moving into miscellany. The first question in the miscellany section: can you suggest for us a Chinese word of the day for this story?
Yeah, I mean, if it were only one character, I have to think of the word tu. So tu, second tone, comes from, for instance, tu fei kou she, to needlessly expend one's words. It means in vain.
Oh, perfect.
It's a shuang ren pang. It comes from, it resembles multiple people walking in the same direction. There's a very famous source for this character from the Rhapsody of the Owl by Jia Yi, who is a very, very famous court poet from the Han Dynasty, in which he's talking about sort of the masses of people, and he says chu po zhi tu xi huo qu xi dong, meaning the disciples of, what is it? It's like the disciples of material pursuits. They run hither and thither, east and west, and there's this feeling of needlessness and futility, of energy expended in vain, that I would choose as the sort of character, one of the characters for this book.
Yeah, I've just found the character in Google Translate. Yeah, it's a nice looking character as well. I didn't know it. Yeah, that's a thought. What you just described is a thought that strikes me occasionally. Either thinking, when you just remember something stupid you did, or time you spent and you worry it was wasted, or if I think about someone I know and something, whether they were doing something foolish or were striving their hardest, and life, either their own acts or other people's acts, or life just blew it all away in the wind, and I'll be like, damn, that sucks, and the only way I have to accept it is just something like I was talking about in your standard epic Chinese modern novel. Just be like, yeah, it's because the world is inhospitable in some ways, or its laws aren't particularly convenient for us. Sometimes it's not even a real person I'll think of. I'll just think of some hypothetical situation where someone's done something really cringy, and I'm like, oh no, that says something about the world, because I conceive of it happening, and there's enough people in the world, enough time has passed, it probably has happened. And if you just think of how much stuff is happening in vain, whether you know it or not in the world. It's if you fixate on it, it's pretty depressing, but
Right.
it is what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes us think, reading a story like Xiumi's story in Peach Blossom Paradise, we reflexively think back to sort of survivor bias, in which only successful stories see the light of day.
Right. Yeah.
And everything else that is unsuccessful dies in darkness.
And the stuff that survives, what the thing that led it to survive might not be very morally good, or it might, even if it is morally nowhere, like it has no good or bad morals, it could be something totally random, and that won't, we're told, it applies to evolution, I suppose. The things that survive and carry on their traits are well suited for survival. But just because something survived once doesn't mean that trait's going to be useful long term. I can't think of any very good examples, but yeah, everything is very random, and lots of things get buried for the wrong reason and are lost forever. Yeah, I'm sure I remember when I was reading through my first Chinese history book thinking, "Damn!" I've said before on the show, a thing I had no idea going into picking up the book was how high the highs would be and how low the lows would be. But aside from that, there's so many moments where things could have been fantastic, or history could have fast forwarded hundreds of years, but for no one's fault in particular, it all turned to ashes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you think about, Chinese history's sense of narrative, particularly of monolithic narrative, is so strong that it has a vested interest in eliminating those possibilities of otherness. But really, they're always there. Inevitability is written into history by the victors, but it doesn't match the sort of omnidirectionality of the present moment.
Yeah. On to our next miscellaneous question. It's even more silly than the last one. So I've been asking this consistently every episode. I'm not just springing this one on you. If Peach Blossom Paradise was a drink, what drink would it be? And I should stress, it doesn't have to be alcohol. Soft drinks are good. Hot drinks are good. But anything that's a liquid that won't kill you, what would you go for?
I think if it were a drink, and frankly, when I first read this question, when you first sent this question to me, the answer appeared immediately in my head. It's Dark and Stormy.
I'm a bit of an ignoramus. I've heard of it. I've read it on a menu, but I've forgotten what it is. What's a Dark and Stormy?
So a Dark and Stormy can be a number of different things, but mostly it's made with rum and ginger beer with lime juice. It's usually made with dark rum, so dark Jamaican rum. It is obscure,
right, and
multi-sensory, but it also leaves you with a bitter aftertaste.
Yeah, well argued. It made me realize it's kind of a hard question, unless you really take it seriously like you did. So kudos. So last piece of miscellany, it's your self promo slot. So you've mentioned, you've done this and that. Aside from this book itself, is there anywhere really concrete we can direct listeners?
In terms of the work that I do?
Yeah, it could either be something you've done, you want to promote, or just where they can find you online if you wish to make such things public.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't have much of a social media presence because it's too tempting for the darker angels of my nature.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
But I am on Facebook, and you can look me up under my name. And I'm also on LinkedIn, somewhat reluctantly. But in terms of the work I do, even though the PhD has slowed my literary output somewhat, I do have I have a recent translation of a story by Chen Si-an in That We May Live, which is an anthology of experimental literature from Two Lines Press, experimental Chinese literature. I have a couple of translations of Chinese poems out in the Solstice Review as of a month or two ago. And I will have a couple of poems published in an online magazine called The Curator in a couple of months. So those will all be out there, and I'll link to those on both the Facebook and the LinkedIn pages. Meanwhile, Peach Blossom Paradise is on sale both from NYRB and other booksellers. And if you have a chance, I would really recommend The Invisibility Cloak as well. It is truly a remarkable, shortish novel. You can read it in a day or two, makes an excellent gift. There's a whole bunch of used copies out there, so you could get it for fairly cheap.
Right.
And it's actually, even though it is about some fairly technical stuff, it's surprisingly relatable. So both of those books are finally out and available, and I would really recommend them to people, because New York View Books, I mean, they're just so good at what they do, and it's been such a pleasure to work with them that it's, they've really produced some excellent stuff. Yeah.
So I've read The Invisibility Cloak. I got that for my birthday, actually, my last birthday. And what you said about the technical stuff, listeners, don't be scared. It's doing a thing I really like in books, where the main character isn't just some bookish guy. The main character is a hi-fi repairer and salesman, and also what is the term for an audiophile? Like he's an
audiophile.
Audiophile, and he's and it's hi-fi systems that he's an expert in. And I don't know if Gefe himself is an audiophile or if he just did the research, but it's a nice snapshot of not the typical bookish a bookish author writing bookish characters. It's a good example of the opposite of that. I think I noticed, especially as a kid and a teenager reading books, is the good guys always like to read books and the baddies always hate books. And there's a reason for that. But yeah, it's a fantastic book. Otherwise, I'll plug myself here, actually. If any of you listeners have wondered what is there on the show's Patreon, if you are interested in what I've got to say about Ge Fei, and if you're not, that's fine. But if you are, I did an episode on The Invisibility Cloak on its own. No, I just did the one, actually. But it was looking at what I'd read of Ge Fei alongside what I'd read of TrChFic, and doing like a compare and contrast, because both are often called avant-garde, but both are, I think, really very different. And it's just my sort of scrambled, unfiltered and unedited thoughts. But if listeners want to find more, there's that. And obviously there's on the main feed, there's the one I did with Eric Abramson about Flock of Brown Birds. And that's the self-promo, my own self-promo within my own episode out of the way. Speaking of ways, we're about to go our separate ways. But before we do that, as a thing we always do on the show, we take a chance to direct the listeners towards some further reading. So we've rattled off quite a lot of other, Ge Fei's other work that's available in Chinese and in English. What if listeners want to find more like Ge Fei in English or in Chinese? Where would you point them?
Absolutely. So if we were looking in terms of Chinese fiction, there are a couple of titles and a couple of authors that I would absolutely recommend. Right. I would really recommend a book which you may or may not have mentioned called Cherry on a Pomegranate Tree.
No, I haven't heard of that, actually.
Which is by Li Er, one of Ge Fei's old students, who is by now a very famous novelist in his own right. And he is particularly, his early books, he has two early books that have been translated, one Cherry on a Pomegranate Tree, and one called Coloratura, which actually just came out, was translated by Jeremy Tiang,
right, that
are quite excellent. Other than that, in terms of, you mentioned TrChFic, and I thought Annalise Finnegan-Westmowen's translation of The Last Lover was quite good.
Right.
That's another. I mean, that's TrChFic's style, and you need to be comfortable with that kind of irrationality. But it's very well translated.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, when it comes to that kind of clear, painful writing, Dream of Ding Village translated by Cindy Carter. It's from Ding Zhuang Meng by Yan Liangke,
Mm.
about the AIDS village in Henan.
Yeah.
I presumably you know the story, but Dream of Ding Village is an excellent short novel. It's beautifully done.
I'd never seen a physical copy, so I didn't know it was short. But the only Yan Liangke book I have sitting on my shelf, it's Lenin's Kisses, and interesting sounding story, lovely book design, but it's very big, so I've not started on it yet. Who knows?
Sure.
But yeah, there's something to be said for short novels. I have to, before I ask you the next question, I thought about bringing it up before, but now I have to because you've mentioned both Chen Sa'an and Jeremy Tiang. He has translated her. If listeners want to know a bit about Chen Sa'an on this podcast feed, I've got an episode on Ocean Hot Pot, which is a play she wrote, which appeared in translation at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. I think 2018, and I was able to catch that one, so that's interesting. But yeah, you also mentioned That We May Live. That's one I think I've mentioned it on the show. It's a tricky one. I was given a PDF copy of it by the Leeds Centre for Chinese Writing. I think the intention was for contributors to write reviews of some books. It went nowhere. I think the pandemic just washed it away in So I was never. I sent in one review for those books I was given. I don't know if anything came of it. But anyway, this PDF is sitting on my hard drive. But I don't want to read it because the book's design is absolutely gorgeous. I know I keep bringing up nice book design, but this one they've really gone typographically rather than just cover design. It looks fab. So I think I'm going to wait till I have a physical copy to read it. But just based on the visuals alone, I haven't read that one, but I'd recommend it. And I'd be interested to read more Chen Sa'an, having not actually read anything by her, only having seen a play.
Well, she's great. I'm in the middle of translating another one of her stories for the same publisher. Her collection of short stories, A Counterfeit Life, is really a lot of fun. I've actually published translations of 2 of those stories. I published another one of the entries in the Southern Review last year. And like I said, I'm on story number 3 right now. She's wonderful. I love her fiction. She's such an interesting, compassionate, sensitive, like multivalent and incredibly powerful writer and playwright. I'm a huge fan of Chen Sa'an.
Cool. Glad to hear that. I'm gonna keep plugging myself here because things just keep popping up. It seems silly not to grab them when they do. Jeremy Tiang's name's popped up a few times. The next episode of the show is going to be on his translation of Yang Ge's Strange Beasts of China. That came out pretty recently. Cool. I got to read it first. I think it's still in the post. But listeners, prick up your ears. Watch out for that one. That should be good. And but maybe the most exciting thing I mentioned earlier, I've not had authors on the show. I think it's only been twice. I think it's just been Chen Qiufan and Xia Jia, but Yang Ge and Jeremy are going to be on that episode. It's going to be the first
fun.
Me versus me taking on 2 people at the same time and presumably getting the shit kicked out of me. So that should be fun.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, and last question, self-indulgence aside, what are you reading just now? If you're not not really busy, if you've got time to read.
Oh no, I am always reading, and I'm going through multiple books at the same time. In my mornings, I've been reading the poetry of Dean Young. So I've been a practicing poet for a long time now, but more intensely over the past year, I've really been able to up my commitment. And I've read a whole bunch of collections, but I'm reading Dean Young's 1995 prize-winning collection, Strike Anywhere, which is pretty good. And I won't get into it, but it's worth reading, and I can see both why people love Dean Young and also why they got sick of him really quickly. Because he sort of began and ended a mini genre of poetry all on his own. At the same time, I'm reading Ken Casey's One Flew Over Cuckoo's Nest, which I'm embarrassed to say I never finished.
Right.
I've got some ancient Chinese literature that I've queued up. I'm reading the poetry of a guy named Yuan Zhongdao, who is who's a big poet of Ming Dynasty. And then let's see, what else do we have in this pile? I have this huge pile of books sitting next to me. Oh, and also the the printed version of the Pingshu Sanguo Yanyi. So it's the Pingshu performance version of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And the way that I'm doing it is each chapter has a QR code that links to the live performance on Himalaya. And I'm actually, because this is part of my field work, I'm actually listening to the to the performance while I'm reading the text.
Cool. I think that's the first time a guest has talked about being a Himalaya user, and that's one I know about. I gave listeners, you wouldn't know this, but I give every guest a disclaimer on everything I'm going to do with the show. And one thing I tell them is, I upload to this thing called Himalaya, and I realize now I didn't need to baby talk you through what it was, but that's cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Himalaya is very useful. I've pulled a bunch of scholarly evidence off of there because they have so many performances. Cool.
That's interesting. Now there was something you mentioned. Oh yes, I was going to mention what I'm reading. I think because it ties into having mentioned being addicted to that game, The Witcher. So I play that when I've run out of important life things to do. Late in the evening, I sit down and play it. And being an RPG, you fall into it for hours, and then it's time to go to bed. And I see my copy of Beijing Coma sitting on this doorstopper book. We mentioned doorstopper books a few times. Sitting there looking at me being like, why aren't you reading me? I'm a very important piece of modern Chinese literature. And it's like, oh no, it's already 11:30. I can't do it. But that's an episode that should be happening at some point next year. But this end segment has mostly been me doing self-promotion. So thank you very much for being patient with me, Canaan. Is there anything else we've missed throughout this discussion, or any final notes you want to throw out there?
Not really. We've had a great couple hours talking to each other, and we've covered a whole lot of ground.
Well, a few listeners have told me they don't love the 3-hour episodes. I think 2 hours is, again, bringing up sweet spots. I think 2 hours is a good sort of sweet spot. It's not so short that it's pointless, and it's not going into insane exhaustion territory. Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess I'll say thank you too. It was a great chat. I don't know how much you prepared. It felt like you're a great podcast guest because you were banging out the $100 words, but you were using them correctly, which doubles their value. It was quite pleasing listening to you articulating what's going on between the lines in the book and stuff. So yeah, I'm sure the listeners will dig that too.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
Yeah, and should anything else ever come out, maybe if it's just another book in this series, you'd be welcome back on the show. Again, I say that to every guest, but I mean it. If you'd like to come back on, consider yourself welcome.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Angus.
Yeah, thank you too. And that's us reaching the end of the show. So another banger and really quite a special novel. I mean, me and Canaan already said this already, but it's really immersive and it's a really interesting point in Chinese history. And the characters Ge Fei's created are some pretty interesting virtual simulated people. So yeah, do check the book out. It's available to buy from the New York Review of Books. You could get it off Amazon, but it's always better not to get it off Amazon. Get it from a real bookseller and not Bezos Corp, please. The revolution demands it of you. Speaking of the revolution, I'm going to reverse things a little bit and talk about the best way you can help this show, and that's by spreading the word. Forward the revolution, tell your local sect leader as he passes you the golden cicada, which indicates that he is friend and not foe, but also anyone who might be interested in the show. Tell them too. And now I'm going to do the actual plugs. Yeah, we'll do things actually in real reverse. I'll do the ways you can give me money now, and then we'll do the purely following based stuff. So if you want to support the show tangibly, which is what I mean by give me money, and help me cover hosting fees and whatnot, you can do. There's 2 ways you can do that will let you access bonus content. There's the Patreon and there's the Podbean premium feed. They both give you access to all the bonus shows I make about untranslated books about China, be they fiction or non-fiction, or movies, or random thoughts, or sort of my preliminary musings before covering a book on the main show. So like I did that for Peach Blossom Paradise, and I've done that for other books and stuff. So stuff like that. Yes, so Patreon, you can get it all for $1 a month at least, or more. The Podbean premium feed, you do have to sign up for Podbean and their payment system, which might be a minor hurdle for you, but with 10 USD, you get access to all those bonus shows forever, and it's a one-off payment. If you go to the podcast homepage, TrChFic.podbean.com, so TrChFic.podbean.com, what we've got there for you is lots of handy ways to browse the episodes, full show notes, and all the episode art. But the reason I'm bringing this up is there's a support page which lists handy links for all these different methods for supporting the show. So that's that. Okay, let's put money aside and go on to the social media. And maybe most importantly, ways you can get in touch and give me some feedback on the show. If anything I got wrong, then do let me know. If there's stuff I got right, or, more importantly, if there were parts of the show that you really enjoyed, do let me know. As I said at the start of the show as well, if you've got TrChFic relevant news that you'd like me to cover on the show and boost and amplify, well, that's what this show is for. So please do let me know and get in touch. So yeah, forward the revolution, and until next time, 再见.